What is the Herero and Namaqua Genocide in Namibia in 1905? The Herero and Namaqua Genocide in Namibia in 1905 is a mass murder committed by the German colonial forces. It was aimed at wiping out the Herero and Namaqua tribes who were seen as enemies of the German Empire. The Herero and Namaqua tribes were considered to be hostile because they resisted colonial rule. They also fought against German colonialism. The Germans wanted to create a colony which would be solely populated by them, but they failed because the tribes resisted their invasion. The Germans arrived in Namibia in 1904. They established a protectorate over it which lasted until 1918 when Germany lost World War I and lost control of Namibia. The German Empire was a monarchy which controlled the German people. The German Empire was created after the unification of Germany in 1871, and it lasted until Nazi Germany took over in 1933. The German Empire did not become a democracy until 1918, when the empire dissolved and Germany became a republic. Germany lost World War I and lost control of Namibia. In World War I, Great Britain and France defeated the German Empire. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to give up parts of its territory in Europe. Germany lost control of Namibia in 1919. In the 1930s, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party took over Germany and created a dictatorship which lasted until 1945 when the Nazis were defeated by Allies. After World War II, the country was split into East and West Germany, which were controlled by the United States and Soviet Union respectively. In 1949, they agreed to create a single German state known as the Federal Republic of Germany, which was composed of both countries. West Germany became independent in October 1990 and is now called Germany. Along with France, the United States, and the United Kingdom, it is one of 6 founding members of NATO. In 1905, Germany planned a genocide against the Herero and Namaqua tribes in what is now called Namibia. Why did Germany want to kill the tribes? The Herero and Namaqua tribes were the last of the indigenous tribes in Namibia. They were attacked by the German colonialists who wanted to exterminate them and take over their lands. They also wanted to use their land for farms, plantations, and mines. Germany planned a genocide against the Herero and Namaqua tribes in what is now called Namibia because they had different culture, religion, language, way of life. In addition, the German colonialists planned to establish the colony in a way that would allow them to keep the land for themselves. They had already taken over some of the land from other ethnic groups and wanted to take more from the Herero and Namaqua tribes. While their plan was successful at first, when Germany realized that they were not able to kill all the Herero and Namaqua, they instead tried to make them leave. They were forced to go into exile in the north of Namibia. For a while they tried to rebuild their lives there but were eventually forced into Cape Colony as refugees. It was at this point that some of them decided not to stay in Namibia, but rather move on with their lives in their new world. There were 2 main groups of people that followed this path. One group was a small minority of the Herero and Namaqua tribes that were interested in creating new lives for themselves in their new land. They became known as the White Africans or identity groups. The other group consisted of Herero and Namaqua who had no interest in creating new lives for themselves, but rather wanted to keep their traditional life as pastoralists. They became known as the traditional Herero and Namaqua. The identity groups that chose to move into Namibia eventually absorbed into local Namibian society and made a significant contribution in building up the country. The traditional tribes were assimilated with the assistance of social and economic benefits. The geographical area that became the Republic of Namibia was divided into 2 parts, the north and south part. At the point where these 2 parts met, there was a neutral zone called Sandveld, which stretched to Karasburg for about 20 kilometers. In this territory, Herero were allowed to live but no one else. This was a common way of dividing up the country, which was known under different names. Sandveld, Gaullist Line, and the Competent Boundary. In these areas, Herero people were living in their traditional way of life. A year later, after negotiations failed, a battle broke out in which between 3,000 and 10,000 Hereros were killed. The German colonial government was forced to provide supplies for the survivors and begin negotiations. The first major confrontation between German colonists and indigenous African occurred in 1890, just 11 years after they had been defeated in the Battle of Waterberg. The Hereros were able to defeat the German police force and stole guns and ammunition from them. They then occupied the city of Okahanya for a short time before being forced out by a larger German force. This was noted as one of the first major conflicts of the Herero War. The Germans' colonization included mining for uranium and other minerals, such as gold, diamonds and coal, with indigenous people being used for forced labor. The Namibian War of Independence started in 1966, when a separatist group led by Sami constituted the majority of the people living in southern Africa. This was done with help from Cuba and China. The war officially ended in 1989, as Namibia gained its independence and became a member state of the United Nations, UN. Aftermath of the Herero and Namaqua Genocide and lessons learned from history. The Herero and Namaqua Genocide was a genocide that took place in 1904. It was done by German colonial authorities in what is now known as Namibia. The German authorities decided to wipe out the Herero and Namaqua tribes because they wanted to make room for Germans to settle in the area. The Herero and Namaqua tribes were not able to defend themselves against the German colonialists, which resulted in their genocide. In order to prevent future genocides, there are lessons that can be learned from history. In order to prevent future genocides, there are lessons that can be learned from history such as the Herero and Namaqua Genocide. The Germans should have been punished for their crime at the end of World War I. To what extent do you agree or disagree with these opinions? 1. The Germans should not have invaded Namibia in 1904 because they would be invading a country that had no war going on and has no weapons or military power. 2. The recent invasion of Rwanda is a perfect teaching tools on what the United Nations must do to help stabilize and prevent further violence in the country. 3. The UN should have sent a peacekeeping force rather than an army to Rwanda because doing so would be more cost-efficient and less violent, as well as not having a large amount of deaths in the conflict compared to the army. Stay tuned to Part 2 of The Secrets of the Herero and Namaqua Genocide in Namibia in 1905 and don't to subscribe to my channel, please.